I will hand over to Rachel.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And I'm just going to share my screen. It's really nice to see you, Sean, and I've met some of the people from DCU before. So it's very nice to see you. I'll just share my screen. I'll just see admit a few people if you're coming in there. Okay, so I think someone else will look after letting people in because I can hear a doorbell sort of noise. So what I'm talking about today with you is early years and the development of language in deaf children and working with families. And the reason I'm interested in this is because of a piece of research I did a few years ago, which was particularly focusing on families living on a low income. And from that, I started to realise that this was an area we really needed to focus on more about how we interact with parents and how we can maximise early language development. So, in today's session, this is the discussion that I'd like to raise. I'm trying to raise issues which then I hope we can discuss later. So, the first thing is looking at the context of professionals working with families and deaf children, especially in the first 1,000 days of life, the first 3 years. And then I'd like
Rachel,
to, sorry.
Sean here. I'm sorry, just we're not getting your full slides. We're seeing your PowerPoint, so it's not the we're not getting as you change slides, we're not seeing
Uh-huh.
it.
Okay,
You
thanks
might
for
just need
telling
to
me.
change the window that's being shared. Thank you.
Right. Ha, I'll just see. I'm seeing it, but you're not seeing it. Okay. Right. Are you now seeing it? Does that look a bit more like what you should see?
That's perfect. Thank
Perfect.
you.
Okay. I think I need to click on the my other screen. Right, I get it now. So first of all, I'd like to talk about the context of professionals working with families 0 to 3, which is often taking place in parents' own homes. Then I'd like to look at a tool which is an online Word document which we can use with families called Success from the Start. And I'm going to have a look at that, a critical look at that, see the things that are good about it, as well as the things which perhaps are lying behind it. Then I want to have a look at some information about early implantation in real life situations and early language outcomes, particularly looking at a study that's been taking place in London and thinking about how we can make the infrastructure fairer for parents so that they get better support over this period. And also considering throughout about teachers of deaf children working with families and ask a question, can we prepare for that? Because we are often thinking about different cultures, whether that is to do with different socio-economic backgrounds or different races, different ethnicities, different cultures. Can we prepare teachers to work in family homes? So to start off with, I'm thinking about the context for visiting homes. And again, I'm not sure exactly what happens in the Republic of Ireland, but I think it's probably similar to the UK. That is, since newborn hearing screening started, that there has been looking at these international benchmarks as far as possible, which means very early contact with parents and support in the home. So the international standards we're working with at the moment, easy to remember, 1, 2, 3. So by 1 month, the deaf baby will have been screened, usually in a day or two of birth. Within 2 months, there will be a more definite diagnosis through the audiology clinic. And within 3 months, regular support for the family will have started, whether that's from a teacher of deaf children, a speech and language therapist, or somebody else in the early years team. So those are the international benchmarks that we have. It started off with 1, 3, 6, and then since 2019, we now have 1, 2, 3, because in countries where newborn screening is now well established, there should be very quick progression across those first 3 months. Everyone realizes how crucial it is in language development terms for the first 3 years of life. And in fact, I'll go on a little bit later to talk about that in relation to cochlear implantation. So the first thing to ask is, who is in the early years team? Do we have a fair representation in that team? So in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, is the ISL teacher in that team? In some parts of Scotland, for example, we have, in some local authorities, it's the speech and language therapist working solo, and they hand over to the teacher of the deaf at 3. In other parts of Scotland, most of Scotland, it's the teacher of the deaf who goes in. And in some authorities, it's a deaf tutor who works with the local authority and teaches BSL. So I'm not sure, you can tell me, but I feel it's extremely important, given what will come later in this talk, that all options are there from the start in the early years team. But these people often don't have the same relationship with each other. Some are more high status, some are closer to health, and health is where the information comes from to start with. So I'd like to just raise the issue about what it means to go into someone else's home. And this comes from the research that I've done called Telling It Like It Is, where many parents told me of situations where they closed the curtains, they didn't respond to the doorbell, and they hid behind the couch. They didn't feel easy in some cases that the teacher was coming into their house to talk to them about language development. So it does raise issues about intercultural communication, and I mean by that different cultures, different classes, different ethnicities, difference really. And you can't deny really that there is a power imbalance, but it's not one we often concentrate on. The teacher of the deaf has some power, and they are in some ways intervening. The word early intervention uses the word intervening, which is actually quite an aggressive act. It could be seen as aggressive in some situations. Of course, most parents are desperately pleased, but then on the other hand, parents go through a period of feeling uneasy often about the diagnosis, and parents will respond very, very different ways depending on their relationship with professionals and other people in society with status and power. So this was an example of one of the people that we interviewed for the Telling It Like It Is project. And I can't exactly say it in the way that it was delivered, because this was my accent, as you can hear, is English, from Manchester. And this person was from Scotland. But I'll read it out to you so that it gets interpreted as well. These are the professionals. You believed them, didn't you? I was angry. I was angry for a while. See, when I was still I couldn't get rid of them. Like, oot in, they were constantly in. Then at some point, the way he was feeling, they were asking me, are you doing the work in the house with him? So then I was getting upset, sometimes questioning myself, as you do as a parent. Sometimes you're like, oh, am I doing this? I'd be questioning myself. So I was angry for a long time. Now, I'm not saying this mum was typical of all the parents that we interviewed. That was we interviewed in that study, we interviewed 21 families, but it was representative of a group of parents who felt invaded by the teacher of the deaf. And you can see another very common reaction in this mum, that she was angry. She was going through a process of accepting the diagnosis, and she was angry with everybody to start with. But she also felt judged, because what she said in other parts of this interview was that she was being told how to talk to her child. And this wasn't really the way that it was her first child. She was a young mother. So in a way, she didn't know exactly what to do. But she also knew that this wasn't her culture, that this wasn't exactly how she would do it if she had any control. So she was upset about the idea that it was work and that she had to do this work. She was young. She was a young mum. She was 18 when she had this child. So she felt that she was being told what to do by adults, and she felt very little connection with other people. When she went to things such as National Deaf Children's Society, she felt they were all sort of much older than her, married, and had more resources. So there's a lot of things going on in this little quote, but it shows that for some families, and maybe it's quite a lot of families, there is a feeling of a power relationship, that the teacher of the deaf is imposing things sometimes. Now, I know many of us do this work and it's not imposing, that we have an equal relationship, but I think it's important to think about what that relationship is like and how we can encourage teachers of deaf children to think about it more. So when we enter a parent's home, are we teaching them or are we learning from them as well? And what's the position in power terms between us and the parents? Because the parent has responsibility for the child. And quite often it seems that the parent's position is the receiver of knowledge, and often very desperate for knowledge, wanting knowledge. But the teacher also can impose what they regard as right behaviour. Keep the hearing aids in, keep the technology on, talk. A set of guidelines which is not actually average parenting behaviour, and you don't normally, as a parent, have anyone telling you these sorts of things. So on occasion there can be microaggressions. Now I'm not generalising here to all teachers of the deaf, but these are some of the stories that we heard through this piece of research. There can be microaggressions and humiliation sometimes, and we have to guard against that. So, for example, one parent told me that she was living on a low income when the teacher of the deaf arrived, who'd just been to another house, and she knew who the family was. The first thing the teacher of the deaf said was, "Can I use your shower, please?" Which made her feel bad as well, but also very upset. And other times people professionals have passed on to me, or I've heard myself, families being referred to as feral or chaotic, and being told things like, you can have a radio aid for a little bit, but then we're going to take it away because there's another family needs it more. So these sorts of things could be seen as microaggressions and humiliations, which are happening right in your home where you live. So you can see that it is a tense relationship, and I don't think it's one we've properly explored through research. I don't think enough has been explored about how teachers feel, how parents feel in this encounter, which is not in a school. Remember, teachers of deaf children are trained to work, in Scotland at least, from 3 up. They're not trained to work with parents particularly. There's not usually very much focus on that in initial teacher education. So this sort of community work, going out into the community, into people's homes, is for many a new experience. So I'm going to come back to that point later on, but now I'd like to turn to a resource which is used within the 0 to 3 age group called Success from the Start. And the link for this is in the references at the end. So initially there was a project in England funded by the Department for Education back in 2005. And that was set up to coincide with the start of newborn hearing screening being rolled out. It was called the Blue Box. It was a massive box with lots of material in it, many checklists. It was very complicated. It would have been ideal for parents who are graduates and who love filling in forms. But very quickly it was obvious that many parents found it quite overwhelming. It's a set of checklists. You may have seen it yourself because the materials are online. It was a set of checklists focusing on physical development, play development, social and emotional development, and then various aspects of language development. And that is the main point of it, but actually it has got very wide remit amongst all of these different checklists. So Success from the Start does the same as that original material, but makes it more user-friendly. The first set in 2005 I found strange because it apparently was very even-handed. It had information about BSL development and other checklists about spoken language development, and they were very much in parallel, going up from level 1 to level 11. And that was meant, they didn't say very exactly when these milestones would be reached, but the idea was you were aiming for age-appropriate language over the years 0 to 3. So that was good. It had high expectations and it showed both languages, which is great. However, it didn't say one very important thing, which is how much input do you need for these language processes to unroll? They don't unroll automatically. Now, in the Success from the Start, there is a little bit more acknowledgement that to have a child develop a language, you have to have input. So that's a bit more honest than the first set of materials. And also, the checklists that there are a lot easier to use. It's a Word document, so it can be, for example, you can cut it a little bit of it out, you can use a bit at a time. You don't have to give them the complete document. You can perhaps present it in different ways because you have it available as a Word document, so much easier to use. But still, the documents...
Right, just a moment. We're just going to swap over, if that's okay. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
I'll just open the window. I'll just open my blind while you're doing that. Just, are we right? Has everyone pinned the other interpreter?
I think we're good now, Rachel. Thank you.
Okay, I just can't see the other interpreter, but I guess everyone else can. Oh, yes, I can see. Romy. Okay, so Success from the Start seems to be a much better document, much more useful for teachers of deaf children and potentially useful for parents because it can be more customised to their needs. But it still doesn't tell us how to achieve enough good quality input for more than one language to emerge. That is a sign language and a spoken language. There's still, which we'll go in to have a look at. So here's some examples from Success from the Start and some of the messages which are in it. And it starts off with an empowering message saying it's you and your family who have the most knowledge, which is what you want to hear. You want to hear parents being allowed to take part in the normal processes which they control, which is their child's upbringing. But then the message changes a little bit. It's important for everyone to know what your child can do. Now, that isn't normal, is it? That isn't what we most experience as parents. We have to, you as a parent have to change. It's not just that you need to support your child's learning of language. You also have to show other people, as unnamed, how your child's getting on. That's not a normal activity for a parent. So that can come as a bit of a shock. In the Success from the Start, there is a lot of focus on using your voice. If you look at the balance of the material, there's a lot more on using spoken language than there is on BSL. Now, you might think, of course, if you take all deaf children, that's because most deaf children, the majority of deaf children, will be using speech. That's true. It's not a material which is particularly geared towards severely or profoundly deaf babies. But also there's a lot of teaching going on in these materials. For example, introducing technical terms like joint reference. And there's lots of side comments saying joint reference. That's when you and your baby look at and communicate about the same thing. Now, it's good that these definitions are plain, they're in clear English, but it shows also the relationship between the teacher of the deaf and the parent, that you are learning. As a parent, you have to learn this stuff. It's a course, basically. You are becoming a well-informed teacher, and that isn't necessarily what the parent is expecting. And then this part explains about language input, and really there wasn't very much about language input. There's an assumption all the way through that there is plenty of spoken language around the child, but this was the little part which was about the possibility of having a signed language in the environment. Deaf children often learn signs or a sign language such as British Sign Language from adults who aren't fluent signers. Where families wish to learn BSL with their children, it's important to have as much contact as possible with other people who use BSL fluently, children and adults. Where this isn't possible, children's language development may be slower. Now, at least this is saying the truth, which is you can't really, like the first lot of materials, expected the language to unroll with no input. There was no discussion of input. Here, at least, there is discussion of input, but you're left thinking, how? Now, the situation in the Republic of Ireland, I think, is much better than in the UK, but we don't have any systematic way in the UK of providing this for parents. In a few deaf schools, in some deaf schools, there is good outreach to parents in that age of children in that 0 to 3 age group. In some authorities, there is a deaf tutor who goes round. We don't have anything as a right. There is no infrastructure. So although we have a very well developed infrastructure about speaking and listening, we really don't have an infrastructure about providing any other alternatives. So this small mention of language input leaves the parent thinking, how are they going to do this? And it's a bit of a threat, really. I mean, you might want to do it, but what you might be offered is, let's say, a 10-week course by National Deaf Children's Society online at the moment, or you might be offered a once a month play group in your local authority where there are other people, some of them, 1 or 2, might use sign. It's very little. And this was one of the findings from the Telling It Like It Is research. A lot of these parents were desperate for some more support, and there wasn't any system. So I would suggest you look at the Success from the Start materials, particularly as they're so adaptable, and I think you could adapt to use them very well. Some of you might already be using them, but I think in general parents want to do this. Some parents more than others, but underneath it all there are unwritten language policies which are still not really being openly discussed. It does position the teacher of the deaf as the expert, and it does position the parent as the willing pupil who is going to become a teacher of their child, which is not an ordinary relationship to have with your child. There are some assumptions about child-directed language. Now, child-directed language is a very culturally specific thing. Some cultures do a lot of it. In the UK, and I think in the Republic of Ireland, a middle-class family will spend a lot of effort on child-directed language. Other cultures, their language develops perfectly well, but it may be through other methods, such as overhearing other people talking. Now, of course, with deaf children, that isn't going to work so well. So child-directed language is very, very important, but we have to recognise that it is also culturally specific. Different cultures, different backgrounds do it different ways. So there are many advantages of using this tool, Success from the Start, but I think underneath it all there are some underlying language policies which are worth remembering because the relationship between the teacher of the deaf and the parent is very, very important. I believe we can make it much more equal, but I'm not sure this tool helps us to do it because it's not just a bit of paper, it's also a set of language policies which are not always discussed. So now I want to look at some other recent evidence, and this will be, if you are a teacher of deaf children, this will be very familiar to you, but it's a nice recent systematic review of literature about early years interactions between parents and children, particularly around deaf children, and what makes a successful interactions. This link is also on the references at the end and it's well worth looking at. So the best practice from the research reviewed by Martina Curtin and others was, first of all, learn how to gain attention and learn how to wait for the child to respond. Maintain shared focus with the child on a toy, looking back to the parent, looking back to the toy, for example. Learning how to follow the child's lead and responding to the child. Following them in play, which some parents don't do automatically. And learning how to expand the child's communicative attempts. So building on what they have, asking open questions. And then giving increased access to language. For example, you know, when you're using child-directed speech, you often talk with a much wider range of intonation patterns. A deaf parent working with a deaf parent with a deaf child will use larger signs, closer perhaps to the child, maybe on the child, or clearer lip patterns, the light on the face. We know these things already, and many of them are actually very similar to that famous Hannon program called Hanen. Let's see if I can do it in ISL. Hanen. Hanen program, It Takes Two to Talk. Many of them have very similar findings. So Curtin et al. Study is worth looking at because it summarises a recent literature review, a systematic review that is looking at the ones which best show the best quality research, which is important to remember. All of these things are really important to develop early language skills. So now I would like to turn to another aspect of this, which is a study which has not been published yet in a peer-reviewed journal, but it has been published on the internet. And again, this link is available at the end in the references. Now, I've came across this recently, not in preparing for this talk, but in relation to another project. And I found the results really interesting. One of the researchers in this group is Debbie Vickers, who's at Cambridge. And I think it was a presentation with the NHS in University College London Hospitals and Debbie Vickers in Cambridge. But I haven't seen it yet published, and I wanted to find out from Debbie actually when she's going to publish this, because it is a very interesting set of statistics. It was one CI centre in London. So London is an area with a large amount of deprivation, but also when we look at the educational results in London, they're very good in general. The education system in London is producing very good results. So this diagram, I hope you can see it clearly enough, it shows CI data and language outcomes. So we're talking here about spoken language outcomes, and these are children who've had a cochlear implant, and the first bar shows you there were nearly 80 children in this sample, and this was the first bar shows you before the implant, then 2 years after the implant was activated, 5 years after, 7 years after, and 10 years after. This is the same group of children over time, and this is quite good because it shows a large number of children from one area. Admittedly, it's an area with a lot of deprivation in, but it's the same children over time. Now, the colour code shows you red and orange are severe delay, or you can't test. And obviously, pre-implant, it was impossible to use these spoken language tests with the children. The other thing I need to say about this is from the study that they used quite a long period to collect this data. So some of these little children were implanted in 1998, which is a very long time ago now. And so also another thing to say about London is there are a lot of refugees and migrants. So the most recent period, there's been quite a few migrants coming in. And their results might influence the results, I think. So when we look across this chart, looking at this same group of children, you can see it stays at 79 right the way through. We can see that 10 years post-activation, we have, if we look at the ones who've got above average or mild delay, we get down to the light green. That is about a third of the children. And about at least well over half of these children have severe delay, or such severe delay that you can't test them after 10 years. Now, this is a shock. You don't often see these sorts of results reported, and so that's why I'm going to write to Debbie to find out when she's going to publish them in a peer-reviewed journal, because of course we don't know all the details about this study. There might be reasons why she hasn't published them, but that is the whole of a primary education, 10 years. If over half of the children are not getting to reasonable spoken language skills, they have severe delay or worse, they're missing out on their primary education. And that's a real concern, that cochlear implant results are slow to take effect. Of course, they're not so slow if you start earlier. I mean, early implantation at 12 months or below leads to much better outcomes, and this study also shows that. But then, on the other hand, very few children are implanted by one. And in this particular study, they only found 5%. They had much, much better outcomes. So it makes you ask the question, is spoken language development quick enough? This is what newborn hearing screening is meant to be about. We're only achieving 5% by year one. Now, this was not in the UK, but in this particular health board. So I don't think it's really good enough. I'm most concerned that these results show over the primary years that the child is nowhere near achieving spoken language, which is useful for learning. And the other part of this study, which had a large impact on me, was thinking about the results in relation to languages used at home. And in this study, they divided up the children into different groups, and it's exactly the same as before. There's approximately 45 children that they followed who had English as a home language, so pre-implant, and then the last column is 10 years after implant. And then the next group is about 20 parents who had good English at home, although they had English as an additional language. And the last group at the bottom is people who were not using English very much at home or had poor English. Now, the results here are better than we saw for the last slide. The people who have English at home, more than half of them were doing all right with spoken English. Only a very small number, 10 years after, were unable to test. But you can see that 5 years later, which might be when the child is 7 or 8, the proportion with good spoken English was still very poor. But we have a serious impact of having English as an additional language. Even those who spoke English well at home, were speaking English at home, the results are considerably worse. And for children who come from homes where English isn't spoken, you start to wonder why they've been implanted. Now, of course, these children might be refugees. Some of them might have been arriving at a much older age. And so that might be why. They might not have had any early intervention at all. They might have only been tested when they arrived. So we don't know exactly what the detail is about this last group of children, but it is worrying because it makes you think, well, what are we not doing to families that speak English as an additional language? And this was one of the main findings from the Telling It Like It Is research, that families who have other languages are not necessarily getting very good support. So these data suggest that the results are very poor when English is not the language of the home. And of course, we could provide much better interventions. We could work with more bilingual teachers. We could work with more bilingual speech and language therapists. And in London, that's much more likely to happen than it is in the rest of the UK. As well as that, we could talk to parents about what the truth is about the outcomes. And that's a very difficult ethical issue, isn't it, for cochlear implant centres? So what other sorts of early intervention do we actually have to offer them? Because for some children, in those groups particularly where English is not used at home very much, we're not getting through. The interventions aren't being very successful, and it's an expensive intervention, and it's a one-direction intervention. It's not offering alternatives alongside that might provide another language. So there's a disconnection between these unspoken language policies, which we can see surfacing in the success from the start policies, is to some extent hiding the truth. Also teaching the parent to become a teacher, which is a role that parents don't necessarily want to have. And very little discussion about the missing signed input, about the lack of infrastructure in our country and in the Republic of Ireland. It might be quite a lot better, about the missing sign input. How much input is needed in a fluent language? So how can we solve the puzzle of bilingual bimodal input? Well, we could employ deaf sign language users. We could do what happens in the Netherlands, where there is the possibility of continuing classes for parents. Oiseman and De Goes have got a very nice system worked out, which they are prepared to share with other countries for parents, which takes parents up through the levels of the European language framework to get to a level where they are fluent and confident. This is a serious course. It's not a 10-week course in a hotel. It's a serious course in that it gives parents the right signs and it goes at the right pace for them. There are many issues about how you run it, because parents would want to join all the time from all over the country. So I feel like we need a lot more focus on the early years, and the Oiseman and de Goes example seems to me a very good way to go. They are prepared to share their method and share their materials and adapt them to other countries. And I am, within the UK, very interested in trying to work out how we can do that better, how we can adapt their materials so that there is actually something to offer parents. In cities, it's much easier to think about bilingual, bimodal nurseries, where you could get a concentration in Ireland of ISL users amongst staff and children, having a large number as possible. But Scotland, like Ireland, is a rural country, and that's not easy to do in a rural situation. But we should really be thinking about these issues, about how much input is enough in each language. How can we manage to find ways of getting enough input in more than one language? We should be happy to see 2 or 3 languages emerging, and it will if there's enough input. So, for example, maybe we need to think about nursery nurses who are bilingual, bimodal, and prepared to travel, to be peripatetic, or to be near a family for as much as 15 hours a week, which would give enough language input. To do this sort of thing, we'll have to change the law, the policy, and the curriculum. And by the curriculum, I'm talking about the parents' curriculum, the curriculum for teaching a sign language. We need to have all of those things in place. I know in Ireland, like in Scotland, we have a BSL Act, you have an ISL Act, but there's a lot of policy which hasn't caught up. And in the case of Scotland, I've done some research recently with Rob Wilkes of South Wales University, where we've found that education and what happens to deaf children, especially in the early years, is absent from all of the complicated BSL plans which have been devised. So we've got a lot more work to do if we're going to offer choices to families which are actually meaningful, that help give enough language in time. So finally, I'd like to turn to the issue of intercultural encounters. And I'm drawing on the work here of a colleague of mine called Ashley Simpson, who is not referring to deaf education. He's talking about interculturality with other languages, other cultures from around the world, teaching English, teaching Russian, teaching Chinese. But I think many of the ideas apply to us in deaf education as well. And Dervin and Simpson argue that we could try the approach which has been tried for a long time in intercultural studies, where you expect that the teacher or the participant will go in smiling, showing respect, avoiding topics where there might be conflict. But they argue, does this actually work? Does it actually lead you to not engage properly? And if you focus a lot on stereotyping and trying to overcome stereotyping, does that work as well? Does it actually help relationships? They argue it's better to be unprepared. Now, I don't know whether they actually mean that. I think what they mean is, don't kit yourself out with all sorts of toolkits where you know how to approach people from other backgrounds, but rather look at yourself. Try and change how you are in the way that you relate to families that are different from yours. That is, be patient. You might start off at a distance, but try to get closer. And they use a nice example, which I hadn't heard of before, from Finland. In Finland, the word for face, as we use in English, is a singular word. But in Finnish, the word kasvot means faces. That is, many aspects of a person. So when you talk about a face in Finland, you're actually using a plural now. And they use that as an example of showing, of course, everyone has many different faces. And in some cultures, it's easier to see that because the language expresses it. So what I'm suggesting is that if we follow this argument, that too much focus on overcoming stereotypes might not work as well as learning about yourself and learning how to construct knowledge with the parent on their terms, so that when you have an encounter with the parent in their own home, their space, you're changed as well as them. That gradually you come closer and you understand more about aspects of the parent's view. It's not an easy area to discuss. It's not like there is a solution to it, but I'd like to just raise the issue of, how do we approach it? How do we approach this work which takes place for teachers in another person's home? So to sum up, I hope that I have raised some issues, maybe controversial issues, which will be good for stimulating discussion about the relationships between parents and teachers of the deaf. And I hope that I've also made some invisible languages policies visible, which are often underneath the documents that we use. I know in Ireland you have the Visiting ISL Teacher Service, which is a lot more infrastructure around alternative languages than we have in the UK. We don't have anything systematic at all. I think teachers of deaf children can be reflexive practitioners. I think they can, but how do we get them ready? Can we prepare people for these encounters? So finally, I think it is possible. It takes honesty, and I think it means that as teachers, we forget about being a teacher. We move closer to being a co-constructor with the parent. We both change by the encounter. We recognise and respect the parent's space, and we support multilingualism. And I think these are important principles for early years work. So I'll take some questions now. And also I'd like to mention the references which you can find, you can click through when you get the PDF to those links.
Rachel, this is Sean again. I'm just going to come back in and say a huge thank you for that presentation. It was fascinating and so informative. I know on behalf of Elizabeth and the school and everyone, we're very grateful that you were able to share your knowledge and your expertise today. We have about 20 minutes for questions. So if anyone wants to ask a question, if you use the, I'm going to actually, first of all, stop recording. But if you use